Hey everybody, before we get started with this week's episode, I just wanted to hop on and address some feedback that we got last week. I want to make it abundantly clear that I have an incredible amount of respect for Don's and residents' life staff, and just a huge appreciation for the incredibly important work that they do. It's a difficult job, and I would like to offer a full apology for anything that I said that made it sound as if I have anything but respect and admiration for those folks doing those jobs. So, with that being said, here is this week's episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the latest, the official podcast of the Brock Press. We take you beyond the headlines and do a deep dive into some of the many interesting articles written by our team this week. This week, I am joined by Holly Morrison, as always, as well as one of our news editors, Devani Shaw, and we are going to be looking at the OUA championships and kind of giving updates on Brock's performance there across many sports. Holly's opinion piece on Pride and corporate sponsorship of Pride events, and Devani's review of the new season of Bridgerton. So it should be a great episode, as always, as if not all of our episodes are great. Of course they are. All right, so with all that said, let us get into the topics.
All right, so the first thing that we're going to be talking about is some more Brock sports stuff. Some super exciting, interesting things happening. More banners for the Badgers sports program. So we're just going to talk about some of those results, some of the excellent articles written by our sports team, Jonah, Liam, and Morgan. So I guess we'll just start off with the very good news. Brock's men's basketball team are OUA champs. They beat the Queens Gales 95-75. Very good game. So very much congratulations to them. But unfortunately, the women's basketball team couldn't repeat last year's championship. They lost the Critelli Cup to the Rams, and it was really kind of a heartbreaking game. They were up 61-39 with 7 minutes left in the fourth quarter, and the Rams just went on a 28-6 run and forced it to overtime, where they won by 1 point. So not the best game for the Badgers, but they will be heading to nationals. Second place, guarantees them a spot at nationals. So there is still that to look forward to. And if you'll remember from last year, the women performed very well at nationals. They almost won the whole thing, came in second. In terms of volleyball, obviously the men are already out. Their season came to an end last week, but the women headed to nationals, where they lost their first 2 games of the season, which I think is pretty indicative of the fact that they're really good, that it took until nationals for them to lose a single game. They lost in the quarterfinal to the Mount Royal Cougars, but then they got sent to the consolation bracket, where they beat Dalhousie. I'm going to say Dalhousie in the consolation semifinal, but lost to the University of Toronto in the consolation final. So that sent them home, but overall a very, very good season for the women's volleyball team. And in terms of hockey, the men have yet to play a game. They're sitting tight, waiting for their first games to start. Women's hockey it was a tough end of the season for them. They're OUA champions, but they lost to the University of Saskatchewan Huskies in their first game, which sent them to the consolation bracket. And then they lost their consolation semifinal against the University of PEI. But, like we said, with all the other teams, still lots to be proud of. An OUA championship is nothing to turn your head at.
Yeah, huge kudos to all of them. Everyone's doing great. Great to hear, like you said, some banners coming home, so that's great. Yeah, some tough losses, but I mean, strong performances in the end, and I mean throughout the season they've been all pretty dominant. It's been a pretty great year for Brock Sports, so they got lots to be proud of, even if it gets tough at this point, which justifiably so, rightfully so. It is the finals, so yeah, kudos to all of them for all their great performances.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely an achievement to get to nationals in the first place. So absolutely big congratulations to all the Brock sports teams. Pretty much everyone did very, very well this year. All right, so one of my opinions this week is about Pride. It's Pride Month at Brock. It's going to be Pride Month in June. Obviously we don't publish during June, so more timely now. But I wrote about Pride parades, Pride events, and sort of corporate sponsorship, and whether or not it's worth it. So I went into the concerns, how corporate sponsors of Pride events can be a little bit shady. They can be a little bit duplicitous at times. The things that they do can be sort of contradictory to like the intended purpose of the events themselves. And for that reason, I think that like corporate sponsorship of Pride isn't quite worth it, and they definitely don't have a place at Pride in the same way that people do. So I guess I just wanted to ask both of you guys. One thing that I've definitely noticed in the last few years is that there have been like more corporations wanting to get in on like the whole like, woo, go rainbows, we support the gays Pride Month thing. So I was wondering if you guys have noticed that too.
Absolutely. I think like just like seeing kind of all these campaigns like externally, I think there's been a lot of dialogue lately, just kind of talking about how a lot of these campaigns can be sort of performative, and how kind of as soon as the month ends, let's say, come July 1st, it's kind of like back to the same old. And even I know in my experience, kind of like through co-op and in some of my like employment, I've sort of seen that where like the company culture doesn't necessarily provide kind of support, but they do go all out with the rainbow flags come June. So it's just kind of like, okay, that's step one, but what now?
Also, if you look, beyond just North America and, friendly parts of Western Europe, it's always interesting to see the international branches of companies and how they kind of differ in their approach to Pride Month. Like if they're based in a country that is, where it's either outlawed or at least, not socially accepted in the same way as it is over here. And, not to say that, LGBTQ folks have it easy or anything, but just to say that like it's certainly far more accepted here than in some cultures. And, it's interesting to see the difference in their approach of a company's Twitter page that represents their North American branch versus, represents a branch in a country or, area of the world that is, much more hostile, which I think exemplifies that point that you're talking about, is how, it is not wholly necessarily performative. It's not to say that the intentions of individuals within companies may not be pure. But like Holly, like you said, it's like trying to personify companies to make them like human or emotive or like caring or like vessels for like social change and social justice. And as you rightfully point out, they basically have never been, in all of history, have never been vessels for that type of change and progress. And yet they're happy to glom on and hop on the bandwagon and try to profit, as you say, try to get that pink dollar, which is, I mean, as scummy as it gets, but I mean, nothing more scummy than they normally engage in.
Yeah, totally. Like one of the things that I definitely wanted to like get across that I felt was like like a corporation is not a person, and it does not have the morality of a person. Corporations rarely, if ever, do the right thing just because it's the right thing. They might do the right thing after other people have done the right thing because it's the right thing, and now it's okay. But, they certainly weren't there organizing for, you know, marriage equality or like against police brutality, especially of like trans women of color. That's not something that corporations have ever done. So they definitely, like in my opinion, are not as big a part of Pride as, the people who have been organizing this kind of stuff, and they really are just in it for like, it's like they realized, oh hey, people have money. But also it's a little bit deeper than that. They were like, oh, hey, gay people aren't like being brutalized and, marginalized as much as they were traditionally, and now they have money and we want it. So I think that's where that comes from. But also another thing that I wanted to ask about was there's this sort of idea that like corporations being like visibly rainbowified and like pro LGBT, pro like two-spirit, transgender, intersex folks, is like a sign of like social progress, and that it's overall a good thing. And I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but I guess I just wanted to get your thoughts on that idea.
I think it's actually, well, this is hard to say because it's almost a chicken and the egg scenario. But from my perspective, it almost feels like they've served as a lightning rod for people who are homophobic and transphobic, because they've been so cynically kind of tying themselves to the the causes of these communities, especially in recent years. And it's like I think it's kind of fueled some of that the right wing animosity to that. And I mean I see it from the political perspective, from commentators, right wing commentators, where they might demonize a company like Amazon or the Walt Disney Company because where some would say they're run by billionaires and they have so much reach and control in society and own so many subsidiaries and yada yada, right? Like their size is the problem. But then from the right, they talk about how they have a diversity policy and how that's so evil and how that's why they're so terrible in society. It's like you're totally missing the point here. But I think that's kind of what I'm trying to get at, is that I think they've served as lightning rods for bigoted people and bigoted views, and they've kind of riled that up a little bit, I think. And I think you see that with recent legislation in a lot of states across the United States. So there's increasing pushes to re-institutionalize discrimination that was had been abolished of the LGBTQ community. And I think that's concerning. And personally, I think it's somewhat related to this, but again, that's really hard to prove. And I personally don't have proof of it. I'm just kind of putting pieces together that I've seen.
Yeah, and like piggybacking off of what Noah said, I think like kind of you mentioned in your article, Holly, the example of Amazon wanting to sponsor the Seattle Pride Parade, but then kind of coming under fire, how the actual Pride organization said no because of Amazon donations and ties to anti-LGBTQ groups. And I think that kind of is like, it's sort of makes me think like, okay, yes, let's paint the town rainbow for the month of June. But then it's also like these corporations aren't necessarily taking a stand when there's legislation being passed in, for example, recently Florida, that's in direct relation to kind of the whole point of Pride. So yeah, I agree. I'm not sure if it's having as much of an impact as maybe people think, because I think that there's still very much like injustices that are happening like right under our noses. And if you want to speak up and if you want to be an ally, I think there's got to be a little bit more meaning behind the action.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that like I've heard other people say is like the idea that like people want to like see themselves as like activists and like people who like would have done the right thing. Like people love like movies about like activists, like people like I don't know, Milk, for example. Like they like to like have the idea that they would have been like campaigning for marriage equality or something. But also like right now there's a lot of anti-trans legislation being passed. There's a lot of violence being committed against, you know, particularly the trans community. There's still like homophobia embedded in like so many systems, and like people aren't doing anything about that. I think it's like a lot of people and a lot of corporations just want this like cause to cling on to be like, yeah, I'm a good person. But it's not a difficult thing anymore for the vast majority of people to just be like, oh yeah, gay people are fine. I have a rainbow flag. That's cool. You know, I'll go to Pride. It's fun. Like that's not a difficult task. And I think corporations don't want to do any of the difficult parts of like being a part of like the LGBT community. They just want to like throw their logos on pride flags, which I think brings me to like the final thing is that it feels very much like it just feels kind of icky. Like it's sponsorship obviously, but it's like the monetization of activism essentially, which doesn't super sit right with me. So I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on that.
I want to actually comment on what you had just said before and responding to Devani, because you had mentioned that they don't really want to be involved in like the heavy lifting in the LGBTQ community and kind of the fight for equality and things and fighting against discrimination. I think they don't, and this is a generality. This might not be true in every case, obviously. I'm not saying this about every single company that tries to have a social conscience. I think it's possible for them to do that. But on the whole, I think like huge companies that come up with these big ad campaigns of how much they support X, Y, and Z issue, I think they prefer just the aesthetics of protest, like you said, that, you know, people really, especially lately, have kind of really identify with that and want to, you know, see that as a positive thing, something that they would hope they would, you know, have been a part of important movements in history, right? They would have, been a part of positive things throughout history as in like an activist role. And so I think really what most big companies I think would prefer is if they could just, you know, have people out in the street and like not have to even touch on any specific issue, but just, you know, show that whole like aesthetic of being like an activist and being able to benefit from that. If they could do it, I think they would. I think they would ditch any specific issue, just because, like you said, that's not their game. Their game is, again, to make money. And, you know, part of that, especially in marketing, comes back to like psychology. And clearly there's some type of, you know, psychological connection that people have today, especially our age group, like 18 to 34, 18 to 24, the big prime demo that they advertise to, that has a positive association with activism. So if they could really just concentrate that and really just present that to the masses without having to take a side on any issue, I think they would, which is just, you know, peak cynicism on my part and on their part, I think.
No, I totally agree with what Noah was saying. And Holly, in response to your question, it kind of reminds me of, I think maybe I had been on the podcast when we talked about this too. Bell Let's Talk. And when we were talking about how, you know, they donate 5 cents per hashtag or text or whatever, but this is also the same company that's charging these insane rates for inmates who then can't connect with their family and their loved ones. And it's kind of like, okay, great. Like you've got, I guess, like the brand boost from doing Bell Let's Talk. And like, yes, of course you care about mental health, but then when it actually comes down to it, what about the mental health of all these inmates that's suffering because of your doing, like your rates and your company's actions. So yeah, I definitely agree with what you're saying about like, it kind of is sort of kind of like their poster campaign where they're like, oh, we're really great and we care about all these things. And then when you actually dig down into the nitty gritty, it's like, oh, it was to make money. Kind of like how with Bell, like they probably get such a big tax write-off from Let's Talk. So yeah, I guess it's unfortunate, but I feel like that's kind of what it boils down to in most cases when these big companies are sponsoring things like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it definitely does boil down to like either like money in terms of like a tax write-off or money in terms of like obviously the point of sponsorship is like getting people to see your product, and that is representative of like a monetary value. And I also think like the idea of like when corporations get involved in monetizing pride, they can really sort of police the respectability of it. Like they can have like a thing where they're like, oh, it has to be family friendly. Pride can't be at all like sexual, which, to me is that I think is innately like homophobic and transphobic to say that, to one, be able to determine what is considered not family friendly, because to a lot of people, two men kissing is not family friendly. So I think that for me, when corporations get involved in monetizing pride like that, it can kind of, they end up respectability policing, and it's like you have to be super nice and friendly, and you have to and you can't show too much skin, and you can't be sexual, and you have to be nice to the cops, and the cops have to be here, and you can't be at all anti-capitalist. And I think that is sort of counter to just like the origination of pride and of this community. So, corporations might show up at Pride, but I don't think that they have a place there, and I don't think that they really embody the spirit of what it's about.
Capitalist equality, right? In like within that kind of framework is just to say that, you can have a male CEO and you can have a female CEO and you can have a gay CEO, and all these executives can be whatever color of the rainbow they want, and that's the extent, right? That's to them, that's not the first step of equality. That's the extent of what is kind of seen in that limited purview, right? So like the whole point of them advertising is when they sponsor pride events, right? Then they're putting on that limited lens onto these events, and that's kind of the risk you run when you accept sponsorship and donation like that. And it's not to blame anyone for taking money. If you need the money to run an event how you'd like to, then that's kind of the thing you have to weigh the pros and cons of, right? The freedom to do what you want or not. But yeah, I mean, it's not a shock that they would apply that type of limited lensed view to, and especially if they're providing millions, then to have that kind of sway over these events. And yeah, it definitely does take the teeth out of them. It definitely does limit their applicability and like value, frankly, right? Like to the actual community versus the value to the major company sponsor, whoever it is of that event, right? So there is a tough balance there, and it's not one that is easy to make as an organizer of an event, but it's clear to see the impact of accepting that sponsorship.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just like the last thing that I'll like say about it is like there's this idea that like, and gay people, we do sure love to fight each other about niche little issues within the community, but one of those issues is like the idea of, is pride a protest or a party? And the thing that I've always thought and said is that like the party is the protest. Partying is an act of protest for a community that has not been allowed to do that historically, and that's the idea of party as protest. I don't think it's something that corporations are going to get behind, and I think that then is detrimental to just the whole thing.
Now, they are sanctioned as parades, though, normally, right? They are actually run through the city, so it's, in legal terms, it might wouldn't be a protest. But I see what you're saying, and you said it really eloquently in your article as well about the act of being there and being who you are, who, you know what I mean, like who everyone is there, and expressing that openly in a public square in a understanding, like from a wider historical context, is obviously very defiant and brave action. But my my government and legalistic brain is like, well, actually, it's not a protest because they usually get approval from the city to close the streets for their parade, and I'm like, no, that's not the point. That's not the point. I have to try to shut that part of my brain up for a second.
Protest not in like the legal sense, protest in like the spiritual, metaphorical, gay sense.
Yes, exactly. I do get it now. I'm just wrestling that annoying narc side of my brain.
Poli-sci brain.
The most Noah thing I've ever heard. All right, so this week I wrote about the second season of Bridgerton, which, if you know me, you know that I haven't shut up about it. And I was going to share a little more of my thoughts because I couldn't fit it all in a 500-word review. But I personally think this season was even better than the first, even though I also binged the first when it came out a year ago. I think just like everything from the costumes, the casting, the sets, like everything was very well done. And I was reading, a lot of people surprisingly found that it was a pretty solid adaptation. It is based on the books by Julia Quinn, and a lot of people who have read the books, I haven't, are saying that they thought it was very well done, that it kind of balanced what actually happens in the books with a little bit of new content for people who have read the books but obviously don't want to spoil it for themselves. So I wanted to ask you, Noah, what is either a very good book to movie adaptation in your mind, or maybe just a really bad one?
This tells you how much fiction I read, which is to say not a lot at all. Because the only one that really comes to mind is the one where I was into the books at the time, and then the movie came out pretty much very shortly after I was reading it, and it was just like a perfect storm of like being interested in that series. Was The Hunger Games, which I'm not proud to say because I don't read fiction. I really don't. It's just not my thing. But at that time, I remember being disappointed with the first movie because I didn't think it held up to the book very well, and it kind of missed out. And that's kind of the issue with adaptation, is that especially if it's being told from the perspective of your main character, if they're the narrator in the book, you miss out on so much. And frankly, I don't think it's ever really portrayed very well on film. But I think that's just kind of the consequence of the medium difference, the difference in medium there. But yeah, I think it probably would work better coming from the perspective, like a narrator that is not, tied to any of the characters, more of a third person narrator. But yeah, I know I'm not I'm not the best for this topic because I'm not a huge fiction fan. Obviously, all my reading is very serious, very nonfiction.
Yeah, you strike me as a Atomic Habits, Sapiens kind of guy. Honestly, yeah, I think in terms of, I agree. I actually rewatched The Hunger Games recently. And by recently, I mean like 2 weeks ago. And I think watching it now, probably like 10 years after I read the books, it was a good movie. I think they did a good job of adapting it for people who hadn't read the books. But yes, I do remember initially when it came out, it was a bit disappointing. I think even the casting, I just didn't think that they did a very good job of because in my mind, when I'm reading, I have this image of what these characters look like, and the people they picked were just so far from it. But again, I guess the author might have a better idea of what these characters are supposed to look like. So maybe that's just a me thing. But in terms of a good book adaptation, I don't know if you had to read this in high school, but I had to read Great Gatsby, and I think they did such a good job with the movie. I really liked the way that they, like Gatsby's house was the exact same as I imagined it, and the little house next door where Nick lived, Daisy across the lake. Like, I think they did a really good job with that. But yeah, it's definitely tough. I see what you're saying, kind of bringing it from paper to film in like an hour and a half too, trying to tell the same story. Very hard to get right.
You're right. Gatsby was a good one. I loved that movie. And I did, now that you say that, I did definitely read that book in high school too. But yeah, that was a great one. I have to see that movie again. That was a really fun movie, even though, it's not a necessarily, well, it's fun subject matter in my mind because I'm very cynical, and I appreciate seeing that in my media. But yeah, that's a great one. I have to watch that again. That does it for another episode of The Latest. Thank you, Holly, for joining me to talk about the many great articles we were able to talk about today. And thank you all for listening. We really appreciate it. Remember that you can find the full articles we talked about here today and many, many more by going to our website, www.brockpress.com. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at The Brock Press. On top of following us on social media, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor, Breaker, Google Podcasts, you name it. Anywhere you listen to podcasts, you'll find us. Just look up The Brock Press podcast, The Latest, and you should find us with no issues. You can also find us on our YouTube channel, and it's also on the website. So no excuses. It's everywhere. Make sure you don't miss an episode. With all that said, thank you again, and we will see you next time for another episode of The Latest.